Hello, today we're going to talk about Fastify, another Node.js web framework, and they're all about being fast. In fact, they've got benchmarks on their website here, and they claim to be faster than all of these other guys, which kind of makes sense. I think it'd be pretty funny if they called themselves Fastify and they weren't the fastest one. Anyways, in this video, we're going to take a look at this framework, how to create a new application using Fastify. How does it compare in terms of syntax and features to something like Express, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. And then finally, we're also going to use TypeScript with it so that you can compare it with the other frameworks that I talk about in my channel, like Nest.js and Adonis, which are very TypeScript heavy. Now, there are a couple of different ways to get started with Fastify. You could, of course, just install it, right, and start creating your first server, as it says here. What I actually would recommend you do is to use the Fastify CLI, which kind of sets up your skeleton project and has a lot of the good defaults into it. In my opinion, it's probably the most practical way to get started. So I've got a terminal here just in my desktop, and we're going to go ahead and install that CLI globally with a -g flag. So Fastify -CLI. And the CLI comes with a couple commands with it. The one that we're going to focus on is the generate command, which we're going to use to create a new project. And what you can actually do is to get an idea of what does the command offer or require, you can do fastify help generate, and it's going to print out to you what are the options that you can provide. So for example, mentioned we're going to use TypeScript, so we're going to use that. So I'm going to do fastify generate --lang equals ts for TypeScript. And then I'm going to provide the name of my project, which we'll just call it Fastify demo. And you'll see it generated a bunch of files for us. I'm going to go ahead and open that up in VS Code. All right, so here it is in VS Code. If you're following along, make sure to run npm install because it doesn't auto install for you. So make sure to do that. And then after that installs, you should be able to see that you've got a couple npm scripts available for you here. You can also take a look at package.json to see what those scripts are. But we're specifically going to run this dev command, npm run dev. And that's going to run our application, as you can see, in localhost 3000. I'm going to go ahead and use Thunder Client here. And let me just copy this in. Right, and if I hit send here, we get back an object with a root true and status 200 OK. So there it is. We already got a basic server running. It's responding to us. Let's take a look at the code. All right, so we've got an app.ts file here, which if you open it up, it's sort of the root application where this is where all the things get registered. You can see that there's some kind of auto loading happening from the plugins directory, which we have on the left here, as well as the routes directory. And this brings into the first point that we should talk about, is that everything in Fastify is effectively a plugin. You know, it's sort of compared to Express, where a lot of the things are basically middlewares. In Fastify, most of the things are really plugins. Now we'll talk about what plugins are in a little bit. But first, let's just take a look at, what's in here. So we see that it's auto-loading something from routes. Let's take a look at routes. And there's a root.ts here. And immediately you see something similar to what we got back earlier, right? From our Thunder client and our request, we got back the root true. So that's where it's coming from. So for example, let's update this to hello world. And by the way, you should notice that our server actually is doing file detection when you're running that dev script, so it's going to automatically restart the server for you. That's something nice that's built into the CLI. So if I re-request this localhost 3000 on the root URL, we now get back hello world. So pretty simple, right? Let's take a look at the syntax. As you can see, it's kind of similar to how in Express you have the methods, the HTTP methods as a shorthand like this. So for example, you can also do fastify.post. Maybe let's change these to /hello, and let's do post/hello. And then we got our handler is in here, which you notice that it takes in a request and a reply. So again, very similar to Express, except instead of a response, they have reply over here. And you can just return directly some kind of object or response, and it should just work, right? So if I go back here, if I go to our /hello and do a get, that should bring back what we had before. But now if I switch this to post and hit send, it's gonna say hello again, right? So it's going to this one based on the HTTP method that we defined here. So this syntax is very Express-like. There is another way to do routes that's covered in the documentation. So if I open it up real quick, you'll notice that you can also do Fastify route, and then you can pass it this configuration object. So this is a lot more similar to something like Happy. So you do have basically those two options depending on what your preference is. Either, you know, configure it via object like this, or configure it via the shorthands like this. And you can see that it has support for get, head, post, put, delete options in patch. In this video, we're going to stick with the Express-like syntax because we are sort of trying to compare with Express, as I mentioned. And what are some of the things that we can notice already here is that, again, you can already just return the object. In Express, usually you would have to do something like response.json, right? And then you would pass your JSON in there. So it's kind of nice that you can just return the object directly. You might be wondering, well, then what is reply for? So reply is similar to response in Express. So for example, you know, you can do reply.status 201, and then maybe you want to do your send in here instead, right? So I can copy this over in here, and let's take a look at how that differs now. If I call my post on /hello, same thing, but now we got a status 201. So again, I think if you're coming from Express, a lot of things here that are very similar. I don't really think I need to go too deep into all of the different options that you can do. But the gist of it is that reply is fairly similar to response and Express. A lot of the same functionality of, you know, you want to change things in terms of what is being responded to the client. You're going to use reply in that case. All right, what else is to notice here? You can notice that we're using async and await, right? If you had a asynchronous function in here, you could easily just do, you know, something like this, right? You can await in there, and that's also something that's a little bit different from Express. I don't think Express has that good of a first-class support for async and await, so it's very nice to see here. So since we're here and we're talking about routing, why don't we talk about how do you parse out query strings and parameters from the request, right? As an example, if I were to do something like /hello greeting equals yo, how do we get this value into our handler? So usually, let's say that we were just gonna return that greeting from the query into the response. Usually you would access that in request.query, and then the key in our case is greeting. Now we got red squiggly here because TypeScript does not recognize that it's there, so you need to make it play nice by introducing an interface, which we'll call query, and we'll just put in our greeting in here, which is an optional string. Then we take this and we pass it in here as query string query. All right, and you'll see now that the type is passed in, we've got ourselves no squiggly. Let's test our API, hit send, and now we got hello yo. So that's how you, first of all, get query strings, and that's also how you make TypeScript be aware of it. And next, how do we do URL parameters? So for example, you might expect to do something like this, right? How do we get that ID? If I were to do hello / some ID, how do we get that back? Well, kind of similar idea if we had an interface for params and we expected an ID here, and we pass in params. And why don't we do the same thing? Let's just return it. So that would be under request.params. And similarly, as I type out, you can see that there's some IntelliSense there, and I'll see that there's an ID. Let's give that a shot. So if I hit send here, we get back hello some ID. So that's how you get URL parameters. So again, nothing very crazy here. It's very similar to Express. So you might start to wonder, all right, what is the difference? Why would I even use Fastify? So let's talk about some of the features of Fastify that is a little bit different from Express. So before we do that, why don't we maybe clean these up and, maybe let's move this thing out of here. Like that. Sit in here. So that just cleans it up a little bit, and let me change this to an arrow function just to be consistent with our post here. Anyways, so what else can we add in here that is a little bit different from Express? You can see in the documentation that it says Fastify has first-class support for JSON. It is extremely optimized to parse JSON bodies and serialize the output. To speed up the JSON serialization, you can actually provide a schema, and specifically this adheres to JSON schema. So let's take a look at an example of that. So there is actually another parameter in here that you can pass in to provide an options object, and maybe let me call this my get hello options, and let's define that up here. And just to help a little bit with the typing, I'm actually gonna give this the type of route shorthand options, right? And what's in there, that we can pass in an optional schema. So just like in the example in the documentation before, what are some things that you can define in the schema? And this is probably something you might want to look into JSON schema if you're not familiar with the syntax for it. But let's just take a look at some examples. So first of all, what does our get do from a schema perspective? Well, we said that it returns an object that has a property hello, and it probably does a returns in the status 200, and then it has a value of some kind of string. If we were to represent that in the schema, we can do response and the status of 200. And what is this? What does the response look like? It's an object. And what properties does it have? We said that there is hello, which has a value of some kind of string value. And let me remove this params here, actually, just to get back to a simpler example. Let's go back to our previous hello world. Now we have the same exact thing, but this time we have a completely different, we have a defined schema. So it works exactly the same as before, except according to the documentation, it's actually going to run much faster if you define the schema. So again, Fastify is all about being fast, being optimized. And one of the things you can do to optimize it even further is to start defining these schemas. And there's a bunch of things that you can define in the schema, not just the response, but you can also define things like the params and the query strings. So for example, if we were to define query string here, so if we were to try to represent our what we had before, right? We had an optional greeting query string. How do we represent that in here? Well, we just put greeting, and we can do type string. All right, so there's your query string, the greeting of type string. So this is supposed to be sort of your simple syntax. You can also do it in a slightly different form by kind of similar to what we have here, where we have type object properties, and then you can also move this in here if you wanted to, right? So that should be basically equivalent, but with this syntax there's a couple extra things that it allows you to do. So for example, you can do required greeting. You can see that when I hit send here, we get a 400 bad request because now it's validating off of the schema, which we said you have to have that required greeting query string. So the way we can make this kind of work again is if I provide greeting, hit send, and that gives us back our 200 okay, right? And this is also something that you'll probably use in actually it's better to use it in a post, right? Because you're probably going to be validating the request object. We'll do an example of that in just a second here, but I just wanted to show that you had that simple syntax, and then you can do the more complex syntax that adds a little bit more options for you. But I don't actually want that to be required. I want that to be optional in the same way that it is here. All right, so let's just move forward. How do you represent params? Well, it's very similar. It's just params, and then you have that same exact syntax that you can reuse. So we can just copy and paste this and just change the values. So we said that in the params there is an optional ID, so we'll change here to ID, right? So basically the same object. So there you have it. We've got a basic schema that represents our request and response. Now the immediate thing you might notice here is, isn't it kind of painful that we're effectively defining the schema twice, right? Because we got the JSON schema, but then we also need to sort of represent that same exact schema in our TypeScript definitions. Ideally, there's a way to kind of combine the two so that you can have both in some way. One of the things that they recommend in the documentation is using this library called TypeBox, and you can see that it's basically a JSON schema builder that has built-in types for TypeScript. So we'll take a look at how to use this. All right, so let's take a look at how we can potentially improve this to be sort of merged with the TypeScript types so that we don't have this duplication. In a terminal, I'm going to open and install a new package here called @Sinclair/typebox. All right, so once that installs, let's take a look at how we can start defining the schema and the type at the same time. So I'm going to import static and type from that new library. Now let's look at how can we define both this interface and this object here for the schema. Well, here's how you do it. We're gonna do, let's call this query string, and we're gonna use that type from TypeBox, and we're gonna say this is an object that has greeting. And what is greeting? It's an optional value of type string. All right. So notice that we mark it as optional. That's pretty important. You know, I think if it's required, you can just do, you know, something like this, right? Or maybe you had a number, and I believe that will assume that it's required if you don't wrap it in optional. But let's go back to our original example, which we just have an optional greeting, which is a string, and then we need to be able to extract the type from that. So we're gonna do query, and this is effectively gonna replace this guy, right? So I'm gonna delete that. Query static type of query string. So if we take a look, what is the type definition for query? It's the same exact thing we had before. We have an optional greeting, which is a string. Now, what happens from here, since we named that the same, that still applies to the type that we provide here, which gets applied to our get handler request down here. So that's still okay. But then where this comes very handy is this actually represents the same object that we would need down here. So we can replace this whole thing with that new TypeBox query string, and that's going to achieve the same exact thing. So as an example, let's maybe backtrack a little bit here and make this required again, just to test out that it's working in the same way that we did before when we added the required property. So you'll notice that now the type for this is a required greeting, and if I hit get/hello without the greeting, we get back our 400 bad requests again, right? So that works exactly the same way as before, but it's a little bit nicer syntax, I think, and provides you a way to sort of define both the type or the interface for TypeScript as well as the JSON schema, which is very nice. So you don't even have to really memorize the syntax for JSON schema at this point, so it's kind of nice to know about. So let me go back to it being optional, and then similarly, let's try to represent the rest of these guys. Let's maybe call this params schema, and we'll do, it's basically the same as this, right? So we'll do type and optional ID, which is a string, and then same thing as this, but it's gonna be param schema, and this is just params. So that replaces that, and we're gonna use param schema down here. All right, and if you take a look at that TypeBox library, there's a bunch more things you can do in here where, you know, I'm just scratching the surface, but as you can see, various other things that you can do representing different data types, different formats. So for example, I think I saw an example here where you can do, here we go, you know, maybe you have a string that has a email format, a number has to be of some kind, in this case multiple of 2. So lots of other things in here that you can add in to represent the schema of your request and response. All right, so maybe just to be complete, why don't we go ahead and actually convert this 200 response as well. So we need to represent that as schema up here. Maybe let's call this greeting. You know, let's just assume that the response object is some kind of greeting entity, right? So we'll do another type dot object, and we say that there's a hello property in there, which is a string required, so not optional. We should be able to replace this object over here with just greeting. All right, so now we have a 200, and the response shape is of greeting, which is represented here, right? So for example, what if we return an empty object? That should actually result in an error. If I hit send here on get hello, it's going to say internal server error, hello was required. It should have expected to return an object with hello in it. So it's kind of making sure that it adheres to that response schema. Now it's nice to have validation around query strings, params, and response, but where you actually likely would be using validation the most is in validating the body schema. So for example, again, if we were to do a post on /hello, and let's say that we're requiring an object that has greeting in it as well, because we want to post a greeting, right? So maybe let's just take advantage of this existing greeting type. If we wanted a DTO that has the same exact shape as that, we can utilize that. So what does that look like? So if we were to add our own options in here, right? So let's maybe create a new, create greeting options. Not very creative with my naming here, but it's whatever I can come up with a fly. So similarly, we probably want a schema in here, right? And let me actually add this type again to have a little bit of help from TypeScript. So in this case, what we want to add is a body schema, right? And again, you can, if you know the JSON schema, you can write it directly, or we can just take advantage of TypeBox again over here. So I'm going to take greeting here, and I'm going to use that to be the same schema for a body, right? And even just that, let's not add much more to it, but let's go ahead and test if our validation works. If I switch over to post here and I just hit send, I've got a 400 bad request saying the body should be an object. Well, all right, let's make it happy. Let's make it give an object body here. So hit send. It's still a 400 byte request because it's saying body is meant to have a hello property that's required. So if I had hello and hit send, actually my syntax is wrong here. Make sure to use double quotes, hit send, and now we got a 200 status. Well, for a post, we probably want a 201, right? So let's do 201, and why don't we just return that same schema again, right? So we probably want to add in here a reply dot status of a 201, so that when we hit send here, we get back a 201 created, and then our same schema, right? So that's, I think, the important parts to know about with Fastify routing, as well as how do you make it play well with TypeScript, right? The big thing is it has a very huge preference towards representing things in JSON schema. It's obviously optional, but it is the main thing that makes it fast. If you represent your route options in a JSON schema like this, and you define all the things that it needs, especially in terms of request and response, it just speeds up that whole serialization process. All right, so I don't really think I'm gonna do much more with this, but maybe let's talk about what are some other things that we can add in here that are maybe a little bit different from Express. Again, I think this video is more about comparing it with Express, as well as just seeing what features does Fastify offer us, right? So I'm gonna simplify this back to just my single hello, just so we're pretty simple and clean here. What are some more things that we can add in here? You might have seen in the terminal, we got these nice logs, right? Well, if you simply just use console log, how does that look? If I just, log the string, if I sent this get request to slash hello, you've got my I am here, but it doesn't have all this, nice coloring and stuff like that. So that's what the logger allows us to do. So if I were to switch this to request.log.info and did that request again, you'll see that I am here is now in that nice little green, and you can change this to be, maybe we want to let's try error, and let's hit that send request again. You see that, oh, now it's red and it's got the nice little siren there. So that's kind of nice. So in Express doesn't really have anything like that built in. You'd probably use like there's a debug library that's similar, right? So this guy, but it's nice that logging is such a fundamental thing in server-side development, so it's nice that they have that built in. All right, so there's some basic logging for you. What else do we want to talk about? We might as well revisit the idea of plugins, right? So it probably was not obvious, but you'll notice that this whole root.ts file is really a plugin. And again, really, you can think of Fastify as a very modular system where effectively everything is a plugin. Like for example, if you have a bunch of routes like we have here, that would be its own plugin. And that's why in the app.ts, you see that our routes are being registered as a plugin. Now, when you're first getting started with learning this plugin stuff with Fastify, I highly recommend taking a look at the Hitchhiker's Guide to Plugins in their own documentation, which really does a good job of explaining, what's going on here, right? So it tells you that Fastify was built from the beginning to be an extremely modular system, and they built a powerful API to kind of enable this. And the big idea is that as you create or register a new plugin, it kind of creates its own sort of context. And within that context, you can start defining extra things that is fully encapsulated from its ancestors, right? And it talks about, it's very big on the idea of encapsulation, where you can see where register creates a new Fastify context, which means that if you perform changes to the instance, those changes will not be reflected in the context's ancestors, in other words, encapsulation. And why is that important? Basically, they go in here where they just talk about how you're creating blocks that are sort of easy to split apart into microservices and break apart and move around as much as you need to, right? So every time you see Fastify register, it's really sort of taking a plugin and creating that new context. So similarly, in our own code, you saw that there is a register for the routes and a register for some other plugins in here, right? So everything is just a plugin, and every time you create a plugin, it creates a new context, right? So for example, maybe within our root, you can see that this is a plugin, right? The root is a plugin that just happens to have our routes in there. What if we wanted to add other stuff in here? So for example, perhaps you have a utility function that adds two numbers together. Now, one way to do that would be to put that into a function and just import it everywhere you need to, right? Well, you can do that, but another way that you can do it with encapsulation and sort of the ecosystem of plugins with Fastify is you can maybe use decorators. So for example, in my root in here, perhaps if I were to add a new Fastify decorator, which we're gonna call, let's add this add, and what is that? It's just a function that takes a number and another number, right? And effectively we've added something that only exists within the context of this plugin. So for example, I should be able to do something like within my handler here, I should be able to do fastify.add. And notice that we get red squigglies because, again, we kind of need TypeScript to be aware of it. What we can do to fix that is we can add some declaration merging where we say the Fastify instance in here, I want to add an extra thing in there that is called add, which is going to have that same syntax that we had of a number, b number that returns a number. All right, so with that in place, we still have the red squigglies here, but now it's not because it doesn't recognize that it exists there, but because we don't have the arguments. So if I provide 1, 2, and maybe let me put that in our logger here and go back to our terminal, and let me call our service, you'll see that there is a 3 here. That's the decorator being called. So that's a good way to sort of add reusable utilities within your plugins that you can use sort of all over the place without you needing to import that. If you were to put it to a different file, you don't need to keep importing it everywhere. So that's a quick intro to decorators. What else can we add in here? And real quick, I know that I'm adding a bunch of types in here. You probably, in a more typical application, would probably put this in a separate file or something like that. I'm just putting it all here just for quick context, so we're not jumping around between files too much. Anyways, all right, let's get back to what else can we add in our plugin here. Well, you can add hooks. So for example, you can do fastify.add hook. And what is a hook? Well, let me first type one out. Let's do on request, reply, and done. And let me just add a console log here, right? And then we'll call done. So what does that do? So if I again call my service, you'll notice that it's in here, right? It's logging in hook. So that's another thing that's a little bit different from Express. Let me pull up some documentation here, is that there is a life cycle to be aware of. So notice that there's all these different life cycle steps from the request all the way down to where it actually starts handling the request and starts responding, right? So there's various points where you can hook into a specific point in the lifecycle and do some kind of logic. Various things you can probably use this to, maybe you want to add some kind of intercepting logic that looks at the request and logs something or changes something, or maybe you want to add some kind of extra validation. Maybe you want to check authorization, all sorts of things that you can do with this. And you'll notice that if you go to the hooks documentation, there's a bunch of other things in here, like we did on request, but you can do all of these other guys. And then we use the syntax where we call done to say that we're done, but you can also do async and await. That works well as well. All right, so that's a quick intro to hooks. I don't think I need to go over every single one of these. And hooks, actually, you can, register it like this, sort of globally to the entire routes, so the entire set of routes. Or if you go back to, remember we mentioned that you can also do the route, right? Instead of the shorthands that we have with the HTTP methods here, you can do that route, and you can do method get. And then this actually also has the hooks into it. If you want to have a hook that's specific to just that one handler, right? You can add like on request and all of that stuff, right? So pulling up the documentation here, you can see that when you use fastify.route, you can have a lot more customization for route level hooks, right? So you can kind of think of it as there's various different points where you can hook into things into that life cycle, whether you want to do it at the application level, whether you want to do it at the route level. It's really up to you. Again, I don't think I need to go over really the rest of these, but just introducing the concept I think is important. And while we have the documentation up, we might as well talk about middlewares, right? Again, if you're coming from Express, you're probably more familiar with the middleware ecosystem, and technically you can actually use middlewares in Fastify. It's just not supported out of the box, but you can use another plugin. Again, everything is a plugin. You can add a plugin that allows you to use Express like middlewares. So it's not completely closed off to the Express ecosystem. There's still sort of a door. How good the integration is between this and the actual middlewares in Express, I'm not really sure, but there is some support here that I haven't personally tried. But you'll notice that Fastify does have its own ecosystem of plugins that have a lot of those things that you might want to use from the Express ecosystem. So for example, Helmet is a popular one, right? So Helmet is probably a good example where this is something you'd use typically in a lot of Express apps, right? It probably was mostly designed for Express, but there is an official Fastify Helmet plugin that you can use to kind of get around that, so that you don't necessarily have to go through this, middleware option. So there is an ecosystem. If you go into ecosystem up here, you'll notice that there is a fairly good chunk size of set of plugins here that you might use in your application, things that you probably expect to have existed already for something like Express. So it's already got a bunch of its own plugins that you might want to check out before going into that middleware route. It's really going to work better because that's how it's designed to be used, right? It's designed to be used with plugins. And there's a bunch of core plugins in here built for the ecosystem, as well as stuff from the community itself. And if we go back to our code, actually, I kind of didn't really talk about it. Remember, there's another folder in here called plugins. What is in there? Well, you'll notice that there's a sensible.ts in here, which just enables Fastify sensible. And what is that? If we look into it, what it allows us to do is to just have some sensible defaults for Fastify. For example, specifically, maybe some nice utilities for enabling, throwing HTTP errors. So let's take a look at an example of this. So, for example, it says that with this enabled, you should be able to do something like reply not found, right? Like if we were to add that into our get request here, and we added, maybe you had some logic to check if something exists, and then you find out that it doesn't. So you do reply dot not found. If I do my get request here, now it's going to respond with 404, and it's got the status and the error message not found. So that's just a nice thing to have in there. Throwing HTTP exceptions is pretty typical for this kind of framework. There's a bunch of these different plugins that you can add to your application depending on what you're trying to do. Maybe you want to do authentication or cores or whatever else. Again, take a look through this ecosystem and see, does it have what you need? So if you're trying to decide between Express and Fastify, this is probably what you want to take a look at, is does it have support for all the things that I might need around? So I covered the basics in this video in terms of making requests. You might want to look into, security. What do you want to add? You want to take advantage of Helmet, JWT, database support. You can see that there is a plugin here for MongoDB. So one for Postgres, rate limiting, and a bunch more from the community. So again, if you like Fastify and you think it's a good choice for you, that's what I would probably take a look at first, is look at the plugin ecosystem. Does it have what I need? Alright guys, I think that's where I'm going to stop this video. Again, there's a lot more to learn about Fastify if you take a look at the documentation. This really was a sort of a quick intro in general. How does it differ in terms of philosophy or syntax? Again, something like Express, if you're trying to pick between the two, or in general, you're trying to pick a Node.js framework, how does it differ? And you notice that I used TypeScript specifically because a lot of the audience in my channel have probably noticed, I've made content for Nest.js and Adonis. Both are TypeScript frameworks. Make sure to check those out as well. If you're trying to pick one that's specifically for TypeScript, those other guys are probably better choices in my mind. And then in general too, if you're using Nest.js, for example, that actually can use Fastify as well behind the scenes. So in general, it's good to know about the ecosystem of things, that Express is not your only option. If you want something that is fairly minimal, kind of same set of features, relatively similar set of third-party plugins / middlewares ecosystem, Fastify is a pretty good choice. Alright guys, with that said, I think I'm gonna stop here. Let me know in the comments what you think of Fastify. Will you use it? Will you stick to the other guys? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you, or in general, if you got any feedback from me, let me know in the comments. Anyways, hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks.